No one argued. Newt went, then Chuck, then Teresa into the black tunnel. Even the flashlight seemed to get swallowed by the darkness. Thomas followed, not even bothering to look back at the dead grievers. After a minute or so of walking, he heard a shriek from ahead, followed by another, then another. Their cries faded, as if they were falling. Murmurs made their way down the line, and finally Teresa turned to Thomas. Looks like it ends in a slide up there, shooting downward. Thomas's stomach turned at the thought. It seemed like it was a game, for whoever had built the place at least. One by one, he heard the gladers' dwindling shouts and hoots up ahead. Then it was Newt's turn, then Chuck's. Teresa shone her light down on a steeply descending, slick black chute of metal. Guess we have no choice, she said to his mind. Guess not. Thomas had a strong feeling it wasn't a way out of their nightmare. He just hoped it didn't lead to another pack of grievers. Teresa slipped down the slide with an almost cheerful shriek, and Thomas followed her before he could talk himself out of it. His body shot down a steep decline, slick with an oily goo that smelled awful like burnt plastic and overused machinery. He twisted his body until he got his feet in front of him, then tried to hold his hands out to slow himself. It was useless. The greasy stuff covered every inch of the stone. The screams of the other gladers echoed off the tunnel walls as they slid down the oily chute. Panic gripped Thomas's heart. He couldn't fight off the image that they'd been swallowed by some gigantic beast and were sliding down its long esophagus, about to land in its stomach. And as if his thoughts had materialized, the smells changed to something more like mildew and rot. He started gagging. The tunnel began to twist, turning in a rough spiral, and Thomas's feet smacked right into Teresa, hitting her in the head. He recoiled, and a feeling of complete misery sank over him. They were still falling. Around and around they went down the tube. Nausea burned his stomach. He was just about to turn his head to the side to throw up when Teresa let out a sharp cry. This time there was no echo. A second later, Thomas flew out of the tunnel and landed on her. Bodies scrambled everywhere, people on top of people, groaning and squirming in confusion as they tried to push away. Thomas wiggled his arms and legs to scoot away from Teresa, then crawled a few more feet to throw up. Still shuddering from the experience, he wiped at his mouth with his hand, only to realize it was covered in slimy filth. He sat up, rubbing both hands on the ground, and he finally got a good look at where they'd arrived. As he gaped, he saw also that everyone else had pulled themselves together into a group. Thomas had seen glimpses of it during the changing, but he didn't truly remember it until that very moment. They were in a huge underground chamber big enough to hold 9 or 10 homesteads. From top to bottom, side to side, the place was covered in all kinds of machinery and wires and ducts and computers. On one side of the room, to his right, there was a row of 40 or so large white pods that looked like coffins. Across from that, on the other side, stood large glass doors, although the lighting made it impossible to see what was on the other side. Look, someone shouted. But he'd already seen it, his breath catching in his throat. Goosebumps broke out all over him, a creepy fear trickling down his spine like a spider web. Directly in front of him, a row of 20 or so darkly tinged windows stretched across the compound horizontally, one after the other. Behind each one, a person, some men, some women, all of them pale and thin, sat observing the gladers. Thomas shuddered, terrified. They all looked like ghosts, angry, starving, sinister apparitions of people who'd never been happy when alive, much less dead. But Thomas knew they were not, of course, ghosts. They were the people who'd sent them all to the glade, the people who'd taken their lives away from them. They were the creators. Chapter 59. Thomas took a step backward, noticing others doing the same. A deathly silence sucked the life out of the air as every last glader stared at the row of windows, at the row of observers. Thomas watched one of them look down to write something, another reach up and put on a pair of glasses. They all wore black coats over white shirts, a word stitched on their right breast. He couldn't quite make out what it said. None of them wore any kind of discernible facial expression. They were all sallow and gaunt, miserably sad to look upon. They continued to stare at the gladers. A man shook his head. A woman nodded. Another man reached up and scratched his nose, the most human thing Thomas had seen any of them do. Who are these people? Chuck whispered. The creators, Minho said. I'm going to break your faces, he screamed so loudly Thomas almost held his hands over his ears. What do we do? Thomas asked. What are they waiting on? They've probably revved the grievers back up, Newt said. They're probably coming right. A loud, slow beeping sound cut him off, like the warning alarm of a huge truck driving in reverse, but much more powerful. It came from everywhere, booming and echoing throughout the chamber. What now? Chuck asked. For some reason, everyone looked at Thomas. He shrugged in answer. He'd only remembered so much, and now he was just as clueless as anyone else, and scared. He craned his neck as he scanned the place top to bottom, trying to find the source of the beeps, but nothing had changed. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the other gladers looking in the direction of the doors. He did as well. His heart quickened when he saw that one of the doors was swinging open toward them. The beeping stopped, and a silence as deep as outer space settled on the chamber. Thomas waited without breathing, braced himself for something terrible to come flying through the door. Instead, two people walked into the room. One was a woman, an actual grown-up. She seemed very ordinary, wearing black pants and a button-down white shirt with a logo on the breast, Wicked spelled in blue capital letters. Her brown hair was cut at the shoulder, and she had a thin face with dark eyes. As she walked toward the group, she neither smiled nor frowned. It was almost as if she didn't notice or care they were standing there. I know her, Thomas thought, but it was a cloudy kind of recollection. He couldn't remember her name or what she had to do with the maze, but she seemed familiar. And not just her looks, but the way she walked, her mannerisms, stiff, without a hint of joy. She stopped several feet in front of the gladers and slowly looked left to right, taking them all in. The other boy, standing next to her, was a boy wearing an overly large sweatshirt, its hood pulled up over his head, concealing his face. Welcome back, the woman finally said. Over 2 years and so few dead. Amazing. Thomas felt his mouth drop open, felt anger redden his face. Excuse me? Newt asked. Her eyes scanned the crowd again before falling on Newt. Everything has gone according to plan, Mr. Newton, although we expected a few more of you to give up along the way. She glanced over at her companion, then reached out and pulled the hood off the boy. He looked up, his eyes wet with tears. Every glader in the room sucked in a breath of surprise. Thomas felt his knees buckle. It was Galley. Thomas blinked and rubbed his eyes like something out of a cartoon. He was consumed with shock and anger. What's he doing here? Minho shouted. You're safe now, the woman responded. Please, be at ease. At ease? Minho barked. Who are you, telling us to be at ease? We want to see the police, the mayor, the president, somebody. Thomas worried what Minho might do. Then again, Thomas kind of wanted him to go punch her in the face. She narrowed her eyes as she looked at Minho. You have no idea what you're talking about, boy. I'd expect more maturity from someone who's passed the maze trials. Minho started to retort, but Newt elbowed him in the gut. Galley, Newt said, what's going on? The dark-haired boy looked at him, his eyes flared for a moment, his head shaking slightly, but he didn't respond. Something's off with him, Thomas thought, worse than before. The woman nodded as if proud of him. One day you'll all be grateful what we've done for you. I can only promise this, and trust your minds to accept it. If you don't, then the whole thing was a mistake. Dark times, Mr. Newton, dark times. She paused. There is, of course, one final variable. She stepped back. Thomas focused on Galley. The boy's whole body trembled, his face pasty white, making his wet red eyes stand out like bloody splotches on paper. His lips pressed together, the skin around them twitched as if he were trying to speak but couldn't. Galley? Thomas asked. Words burst from Galley's mouth. They can control me. I don't. His eyes bulged. A hand went to his throat as if he were choking. I have to. Each word was a croaking cough. Then he stilled, his face calming, his body relaxing. It was just like Albie in bed, back in the glade after he went through the changing. The same type of thing had happened to him. What did it? But Thomas didn't have time to finish his thought. Galley reached behind himself, pulled something long and shiny from his back pocket. The lights of the chamber flashed off the silvery surface. A wicked-looking dagger gripped tightly in his fingers. With unexpected speed, he reared back and threw the knife at Thomas. As he did so, Thomas heard a shout to his right, sensed movement toward him. The blade windmilled, its every turn visible to Thomas as if the world had turned to slow motion, as if it did so for the sole purpose of allowing him to feel the terror of seeing such a thing. On the knife came, flipping over and over straight at him. A strangled cry was forming in his throat. He urged himself to move, but he couldn't. Then, inexplicably, Chuck was there, diving in front of him. Thomas felt as if his feet had been frozen in blocks of ice. He could only stare at the scene of horror unfolding before him, completely helpless. With a sickening, wet thunk, the dagger slammed into Chuck's chest, bearing itself to the hilt. The boy screamed, fell to the floor, his body already convulsing. Blood poured from the wound, dark, crimson. His legs slapped against the floor, feet kicking aimlessly with onrushing death. Red spit oozed from between his lips. Thomas felt as if the world were collapsing around him, crushing his heart. He fell to the ground, pulled Chuck's shaking body into his arms. Chuck, he screamed. His voice felt like acid ripping through his throat. Chuck!